We have liftoff. Hello, class, and welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to be discussing intelligence synergy. I talked about it a little bit last week when I was talking about the federal agencies and how they need to work together and dovetail in order to best support the policymakers at the national level. This week, we're going to talk about that same type of synergy, but we're going to talk about it at the local, state, and federal still, but local and state, we're going to emphasize that a little bit more in this particular week. This is probably one of the most radical changes, I would say, that has come about since 9/11 is this increased, again, symbiosis. That's the word that I used last week. The symbiosis now that's starting to occur at lower levels. I think, I was not in law enforcement, so I can't speak to that. I'm sure that they have their own challenges, very much like intelligence agencies do in terms of competing for resources and stuff like that. And I don't want to form opinions off of films that I've seen or TV shows that I've seen, because it always irritates me when I see, cagey intelligence stuff. But I do understand, from my perception, is that there is sometimes a challenge between like federal and state, etc., of who's in charge or who's taking over a certain operation. Prior to 9/11, there was information very much like Pearl Harbor. When we studied 2 weeks ago that brief history of the intelligence, of intelligence, I guess, like great moments in intelligence history or not so great moments. And just in case you didn't pick up on that, prior to Pearl Harbor, there were U.S. intelligence operations that were intercepting Japanese diplomatic channels, and there were indicators there that there was going to be an attack. But because that chamber of intelligence personnel that was supporting diplomacy in the State Department, etc., wasn't tied to the Department of Defense, etc., there was no conversation between the two of them, and it was just taken for granted. And then obviously Pearl Harbor happened, and then President Harry Truman tried to reform that, obviously, with the National Security Act of 1947. So when we look at 9/11, similarly, there was information prior to the 9/11 attacks. There were, when those guys were trying to get their pilot's licenses and stuff like that, there were things that had been reported, but because of disconnects between like local, state, federal, the FBI in this case, it slipped through, and obviously 9/11 happened, and we can see other issues more contemporary, even just in the last year, where people are like, how did that happen? Why didn't the FBI do something? Why wasn't that guy on the no-fly list? Or why was he allowed to have a handgun? Or, all the drama that, and I don't mean drama in a disrespectful way, but all of the continued debates that happen when things like that happen, a lot of that has to do with one hand is doing one thing and the other hand is doing another, and neither the twain shall meet sometimes. So one of the things that happened after 9/11, though, was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. So a brand new entity was created in the federal government, and they were not necessarily set up for success when they first started, because you can't kind of take blood from a stone. They created the agency, but then in order to fund and man and equip the agency, they took from other entities and put it all together into DHS and all of its subcomponents. So to be fair to the Department of Homeland Security, they weren't set up for success from the get-go, kind of. They have now matured. It has now matured over the years, and they're getting much better at what they do. And frankly, I look at that sometimes, and I think that's a very thankless job. But I have their website here, and I don't know if you can see it, but I am going to show this to you here on my Surface Pro. If you go to, and of course it's backwards because we're in video land, so I guess this isn't going to help you very much. Sorry about that. But if you go to the Department of Homeland Security website, they have a place in there called Building Law Enforcement and Homeland Security Partnership. So I have some additional stuff up for you to look at this week on our website. But when you go to this page here, Building Law Enforcement and Homeland Security Partnerships, this is definitely one of the results from basically what happened on 9/11. But they have fusion centers and joint terrorism task forces, and you're going to read about those this week, and you're going to talk about them in discussion a little bit. And then all of these start with fusion centers. So they have fusion centers in the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, FBI field intelligence groups, high-intensity drug trafficking areas, regional information sharing system centers, emergency operations centers, so like when there's a hurricane and bad things happen, etc. Tribal participation in fusion centers, deployed intelligence officers and protective security advisors, private sector engagement with fusion centers. So all of these things within DHS have been born from the tragedy that really was 9/11 domestically, and these relationships now, and with the FBI and with local law enforcement, this is like when I said last week that technology someday will unify the entire intelligence community. It's going to happen. The same type of thing is occurring here. The greater the technology that we have, the more we can kind of interact with each other. Now, in previous classes, I've had some students in law enforcement, and some of you are probably in law enforcement too, but I've had some students in law enforcement that have dealt with some fusion centers. One of a previous student worked with a high-intensity drug trafficking area and human trafficking, and said that they had a lot of success in what they were doing, and there was a lot of interaction between them and the FBI and local law enforcement, et cetera, and that was going quite well for them. The JTTF one, I've also had several students that were in the military as well, supporting those types of things, and that came out and said that those are pretty successful. But I also have had some still come out and just say it looks good on paper, but there's still a lot of challenges, and the Delta, it's going to take a long time before we all respect each other, etc. One of the other things that is kind of an impediment is security clearances. So when you work for the federal government, if you're in intelligence, or even if you're not intelligence, depending on some jobs that you have, but when you are intelligence and you're working for the federal government, you have a security clearance. So OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, holds those clearances for the federal government, and then they have different investigative source entities, et cetera, that go out and do the background checks and full scope investigations, et cetera, whatever it is that you need to get done. So one of the issues when we start to look at communicating out of the federal government down into intelligence with state and local type guys is, are they cleared? Do they have that clearance to be able to have access to that information or that system? Like say I have this laptop, and I have this laptop up at the FBI headquarters, and we come up with a new program where we're going to ship all of these laptops to all of the heads of state police or whatever, so that we could just talk whenever we want to. This probably already exists, by the way, but it's just a good example. If there's hardware and software inside this computer that's classified, then wherever it goes, the people that have access to that computer have to have that level of security clearance. So who pays for that then? Does the state pay for it? Does the federal government pay for it? Do you onesie twosie it? Are they, do you have liaisons, which we do have? So these types of challenges are also out there in terms of that. One of the things that can be done is that you can set up processes whereby the main reason that information is classified, intelligence collection is classified, and to some extent the analysis as well, is to protect the source. That's the main reason. Excuse me real quick. Cottonmouth is to protect the source. So if you can set up processes for reporting and information sharing whereby you are stripping away that source type information, then we can share it, right? And then we can get it out there. So, and the military has gone through that with like NATO partners, et cetera. We have the Five Eyes. I'm sure you guys have heard that, which is US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, et cetera. So there are ways to caveat information and share it, and increasingly I think this is what is going to go on with this relationship between local, state, and federal information / intelligence collection and sharing of analysis. Why do we want to have the resources from analysis redundant? We want competitive analysis, but if one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, that's a heck of a lot of money going out the door if you have 5 different people in 5 different areas doing the exact same thing, right, instead of sharing the information. So that's another thing. So this week, that's what you're going to look at. Lowenthal doesn't talk so much about this because it's not his bailiwick in terms of that. So I've given you a lot of websites for you to look at. It looks like a lot of reading, but it's not. A lot of them are quite short. So please go out there and take a look at it and have a really good discussion about it. This is a Justice Studies program, and so this is very important. This is the one piece of it that we're going to look at that goes down really into law enforcement, and I'm interested in what your opinions are. So I hope that you enjoy this week's reading, and I will see you in the funny papers, and I hope you're enjoying the class. I am. Take care. Bye.